Good morning, class. Today we will be continuing the same chapter, that is chapter 5, pollination and fertilization. We will be discussing about fertilization today. We have already discussed about pollination, the types of pollination in our previous class. Today we will be discussing about fertilization, the next and the final step which is required for sexual reproduction or fusion of male and female gamete. Okay. So let us discuss about fertilization. Now before going to fertilization, we all know, right, the male gamete, we are studying in consideration with the plant. So the male gamete of a plant is also is pollen grains, right, and the female gamete of a plant is referred to as ovule, which is present inside the ovary. Okay, female reproductive organ, that is ovary. Inside ovary you have ovule so that's a female female gamete. Okay, now first let us discuss about the structure of both pollen grains and ovule. Okay, so first let us discuss about pollen grains. Okay, now your pollen grain has two layers. The outermost, which is discontinuous, is referred to as exine, and the inner one is referred to as intine. Okay, it is made up of two layers. The outermost is exine and inner one is intine. Now the nucleus inside the pollen grain has already been divided into two cells. One is referred to as tube nucleus, another is referred to as germinative nucleus. We will be discussing about the role of tube nucleus and germinative nucleus when we discuss about fertilization in detail. Even though, let me give you a just idea about what is their role. So tube nucleus, what do? They help in formation of a pollen tube. Okay, and germinative nucleus, also referred to as sperm nuclei, is the one which is going to fuse with the egg cells present in your ovule region, thus carrying out the fertilization. Okay, and you have a germ pore. It's a pore in your exine region through which your pollen tube emerges out. So this is the structure of a pollen grain. Okay, we have already discussed about the structure of pollen grain. Now next we will be discussing about the structure of female gamete, that is ovule. Okay, now your ovule is present inside the ovary. If you have a single ovule inside the ovary, then you get a single seeded fruit. If you have a multiple ovule inside the ovary, then you get a multiple seeded fruit. So let us get into the structure of a ovule. Okay, now even your ovule is protected by a protective covering known as integuments. Now inside the new integuments you have nucellus. Now this, in function of this nucellus, it's a food laden tissue. Okay, it provides nourishment to the embryo. Okay, now inside the nucellus you have embryo sac. Inside embryo sac you have 3 plus 3 plus 1 arrangement of cells. Okay, now let us look at the 3 plus 3 plus 1 arrangement of the cells. Now before going through the cells, your integuments is not continuous overall. It leaves a pore like size pore through which your pollen tube is going to enter. Okay, that pore is known as your micropyle. Okay, now in your microphylar region you have 3 cells. 2 of them are referred to as synergid and one of which is your egg cell. Now function of the synergid is to seize the further growth of your pollen tube, because your pollen tube is first going to enter the synergid. So after it enters the synergid, your pollen tube growth is going to stop. Other than that, its function is also to regulate the sperm cell to its respective place. Okay, while discussing of the pollen grain, I told you that one of tube nucleus is going to form a pollen tube, another one is your germinative nucleus. Now germinative nucleus, after the pollen tube is formed, it further divides into 2 sperm nuclei. Okay, now what is the role of division of sperm nuclei, that we will be discussing while discussing about fertilization. Okay, so out of 2, one of is going to fuse the egg cell. Okay, another is going to fuse the polar nuclei which is present in the central cell. Okay, so you have a 3 cells here. Well, 2 of them are synergids, one of is egg cell. Opposite to your microphyllary region also you have a 3 cells. That cell is all referred to as antipodal cells. Now function of antipodal cells is also similar to that of a nucellus. It also provides a nourishment to the embryo. Okay, and you have one large central cell. Inside that large central cell you have a polar nuclei. The another one, sperm nuclei, is going to fuse the polar nuclei and thus forming a endosperm. Endosperm is going to provide a food for the growing embryo, okay, or growing zygote. After the fusion has taken place, zygote is formed. Nourishment to that zygote is going to be provided by your endosperm. Okay, so next let us discuss about the process of fertilization. Okay, now fertilization, before fertilization what has to occur? Your pollen grain, it has to come and stick to the stigma of a flower. Okay, stigma is the male part of a flower, right? So it has to come and stick to the stigma, and the pollen grain of same species has to go and stick to the stigma of the same species of plant. If different pollen grain of a different species goes and sticks to the stigma of a different plant, then the pollen grain is not going to form a pollen tube and further undergo fertilization. It's going to disintegrate there and then. Okay, so let us discuss about the fertilization in detail. Okay, now let us discuss about the steps of fertilization, the process of fertilization in detail. Like I told you, for fertilization to occur, first your stigma or pollen grain has to come and stick to the stigma. Stigma is the female reproductive part of a plant. Okay, your pollen grain comes and stick to the stigma of the plant. Now stigma and the pollen grain has to be of a same species of plant. Okay, it cannot be of a different species. If the pollen grain of a different species comes and stick to the stigma, it's going to disintegrate. Okay, now after sticking to the stigma, because of the secretion of the sugar by the stigma, pollen tube formation takes place. I already told you while discussing about the structure of pollen grain that your pollen grain has a definite nucleus called pollen tube nucleus, which is going to form a pollen tube. You can see the pollen tube here. This one is the pollen tube. Okay, it's going to form a pollen tube. Now through this pollen tube only your germinative nucleus is going to travel. Okay, now after the pollen tube is formed, inside the pollen tube your germinative nucleus is going to divide into 2 sperm nuclei. You can see here it is divided into 2 sperm nuclei. Okay, now once the sperm nuclei through the microphyll enters the synergids. You know what is microphyll, right? It's a portion in your ovule region. It's a pore in your ovule region to which your pollen tube is going to connect. Okay, now after reaching the synergids, okay, the synergid we have already discussed about its role, right? The pollen tube, growth of a pollen tube ceases. Okay, and out of these 2 nuclei, out of these 2 sperm nuclei, one of it is going to fuse with the egg cell present here. Egg cell present here. One of it is going to fuse with that and form a zygote. Okay, the another one of the sperm nuclei is going to fuse with the polar nuclei present on the central cell. Okay, one large cell is present, inside that you have 2 polar nuclei. Now the another one of your sperm nuclei is going to fuse with that polar nuclei and form a endosperm. Endosperm is going to provide a nourishment to that particular zygote, growing zygote. Okay, so you can see here 2 fertilization is taking place. One of the sperm nuclei is going and fusing with the egg cell, another one is fusing with the polar nuclei. So it's called double fertilization. Okay, now after the fertilization takes place, what happens to the other parts of the flower? Okay, what happens to the other parts? Like I told you, your ovule is going to convert into seed, your ovary is going to convert into fruit, your petals and sepals are going to wither out. Okay, sometimes sepals might even stick with the fruit. Okay, your petals are going to wither out. So that's all about process of fertilization. That's all about the process of fertilization. So if you have any queries regarding this topic, you can text. Thank you.